Welcome to Moonlit Folklore Stories, a place where legends and old tales are retold slowly, softly and with care, so you can relax, drift away from the weight of the day, and find calm in timeless storytelling. If you enjoy this journey, I invite you to subscribe, like, and leave a comment below. Tell us where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. It is always fascinating to see our little community spread across the world, yet united here in the quiet glow of folklore. Before we begin, take a moment to settle yourself. Find a position that feels most comfortable, perhaps lying down beneath a blanket or reclining in your favourite chair. Allow your shoulders to soften, unclench your jaw, and let your hands rest loosely. Feel the air move gently in and out of your lungs, steady and unforced. The day has ended. The noise is behind you. Let your mind ease into stillness, like snow settling on a silent field. Thoughts may come, but let them pass as clouds in the night sky. You're safe here and ready for tonight's story. Long ago, when villages were no more than clusters of wooden huts, and the forest pressed close on every side, there were whispers of a creature that walked among the living but did not belong to them. The people called it Striga. She was said to be born with two souls, one belonging to the body, the other restless, hungry, and forever unsettled. Some said the second soul slipped free in the night, leaving her body still and pale, while her shadow roamed the fields and forests, searching for warmth to feed upon. When the soul returned, the body would wake again, but never fully whole. Villagers spoke of eyes that gleamed faintly red even in the dark, and of a voice that echoed in two tones at once, one human, the other distant, as though spoken from under the earth. Chickens were found drained, their feathers scattered like frost. Children swore they heard scratching at windows, not the claws of an animal, but the deliberate scrape of fingernails. At dawn, footprints lingered in the mud, bare and narrow, circling homes like questions that had no answer. People lit candles at both ends of the table, for they believed that only constant light could confuse a Striga and keep her from entering. Priests blessed the thresholds with holy water, while the elders whispered older charms, iron nails beneath pillows, salt scattered across doorsteps, mirrors turned to the wall so that no soul could slip in or out. Yet charms do not last forever, and fear grows in silence. In one small village deep in the woods, livestock began to vanish. At first, a hen here, a goat there. But then, in the dead of night, a cow was found collapsed in the pasture, its eyes wide, its mouth frozen in terror. The next day, a boy went missing on his way to fetch water from the stream. His bucket was found lying in the reeds, half filled as though dropped in a sudden fright. And so the whispers returned. She is here. The Striga walks among us. The villagers whispered behind closed shutters, their voices hushed as if the walls themselves might carry sound into the night. Some said the Striga was a woman who had died before her time, buried hastily without the prayers that guide a soul to peace. Others swore she had been born wrong, cursed from her first breath with two hearts, two souls, but never harmony between them. No one dared say her name aloud, if she ever had one. To name her was to invite her shadow. Yet among them was a man who did not fear names. Father Tomasz, the village priest. He had come from a monastery beyond the river, carrying little more than a crucifix and a voice hoarse from chanting psalms. When the boy vanished, he vowed to confront the creature. Faith will bind her, he told the people. But his eyes betrayed unease, for he too had heard the scratching at the chapel door when all lamps were dark. That night he set a vigil. He lit candles in the nave until the stone walls flickered with restless light. He placed bread and salt on the altar, simple offerings meant to confuse a wandering soul. Then he sat, whispering prayers into the hollow space of the church. For hours, only the steady drip of melted wax kept him company. At midnight, the door creaked. The air changed, colder, heavier, as though the silence had substance. Slowly the priest raised his head. There she stood in the threshold. Her figure was human but wrong, bent at odd angles, her limbs too long, her hair spilling in a tangled veil across her shoulders. Her eyes glowed faint red, twin embers behind a curtain of black strands. The prayers caught in his throat. He tried to speak them again, louder, but the words echoed strangely, as though two voices spoke them, his own and something answering beneath it. The candles flared, then sputtered. The Striga stepped forward, her bare feet silent on the stone floor. Her mouth opened, not in speech but in a low hiss that rattled the pews. Father Tomasz held up his crucifix. For a heartbeat she recoiled, her form wavering like smoke. But then she leaned forward, her shadow stretching across the altar cloth. The bread blackened at its edges, the salt melted as if it were snow touched by fire. "Back, spirit!" he cried, though his voice trembled. For a moment it seemed she would withdraw, but the second soul that clung to her gave her strength. With a sudden shriek she leapt, claws scraping wood, candles toppling into darkness. The villagers outside heard the cry and fled to their homes, crossing themselves in terror. When dawn came, the chapel stood silent. Inside they found the crucifix cracked, the altar overturned, and the priest lying pale and still upon the floor. His eyes were open, unblinking, as though fixed forever on something no one else could see. From that day forward the people knew. Prayers alone would not keep the Striga at bay. Fear settled into the village like frost, creeping into every corner and never fully thawing. No one lingered outside after dusk. Doors were sealed with iron nails hammered into the lintels, salt sprinkled thick across thresholds. Mothers told their children not to look through windows at night, for if the Striga caught their gaze she could steal the breath from their lungs. The blacksmith, a man named Jarek, spoke boldly at first, scoffing at old charms. "Wolves and sickness kill cattle, not phantoms," he declared. Yet 2 nights later, when he failed to return from the forge, his wife found the heavy door wide open, the anvil cold and a trail of footprints, bare, narrow, unmistakably human, leading into the woods. Jarek's hammer lay on the ground, its head stained with something darker than soot. The elders gathered, debating what must be done. Some argued for exhuming graves, for legend said Strigas were often born of improper burial. Others whispered of a woman once cast out years ago, accused of witchcraft, who had died beyond the village. Perhaps she was never at peace, one muttered. Yet no one dared walk to her grave to see if the earth lay undisturbed. Finally they turned to Velimir, a hunter who knew the forest better than most. He was young, but his eyes held the weary calm of someone who had seen too many winters. "I will track her," he said simply, "but not to kill. If she carries 2 souls, one may still wish for rest." His words brought no comfort. The villagers murmured prayers, pressing charms into his hands, an iron knife, a pouch of salt, a piece of rowan wood. Velimir accepted them all but trusted most in the bow slung across his back. That night he set out alone, guided by the pale arc of the moon. The forest was thick with silence, broken only by the creak of branches heavy with snow. Yet here and there he found signs, claw marks scored deep into bark, feathers scattered in small bloody heaps, and once a shallow pool of water frozen around a pair of footprints that faced in two different directions at once. Velimir's breath smoked before him, and each exhale seemed too loud, as though the night itself might notice. Hours passed. At last he reached the edge of an old cemetery, its stones leaning like weary men. The ground before one grave was broken, the soil torn open from within. Velimir knelt, brushing aside frost with gloved fingers. The earth was disturbed, and there, pressed into the dirt, was a lock of black hair, long and tangled. The hunter's jaw tightened. He rose slowly, scanning the darkness, and in that moment he felt it. Not sound, not sight, but the weight of eyes upon him, watching from the tree line. When he turned, the forest was still, but in the silence he heard faint breathing. 2 breaths, uneven, as though one came from a mouth, and the other from somewhere deeper, hollow and wrong. Velimir did not move at once. He stood at the edge of the graveyard, every sense stretched taut as a bowstring. The air was still yet heavy, carrying a faint scent of earth freshly disturbed. Slowly he reached for the pouch of salt and cast a thin line around his boots, a circle small but sure. Then he drew the iron knife and held it low, blade catching what little moonlight filtered through the branches. "Show yourself," he whispered, though his voice carried no bravado, only weary patience. The silence pressed back at him, thick as fog. Then, from the tree line came a sound, not footsteps, not claws, but a low, rasping breath that seemed to echo twice, layered, as if 2 throats exhaled in unison. A shape emerged between the trees. At first it was no more than a blur, a shadow darker than the night behind it. But as it drew nearer, the outline sharpened. The curve of a hunched back, limbs too long, hair dragging in snarled tangles across the ground. Her face appeared pale, waxen, her lips drawn back to reveal teeth too sharp, too many. Yet what unsettled Velimir most were her eyes, not only their faint red glow, but the sorrow flickering there, like embers buried under ash. She stopped a few paces from the salt line, tilting her head as though studying him. For a moment the forest seemed to hold its breath. Then she opened her mouth. The voice that came was not one, but 2. One high, weary, almost human, the other low, hollow, as if spoken from within a grave. "Hunter," she hissed, "why do you follow?" Velimir tightened his grip on the knife. "Because your hunger has crossed into my village," he answered quietly. "Cattle lie dead. A boy is gone, a man vanished from his forge. I would know why the Striga's lips curled." "Hunger is not chosen," the voices replied, overlapping and twisting together. "One soul longs for rest, the other for blood. Neither can sleep." She stepped closer, her bare foot hovering at the edge of the salt. The circle sizzled faintly, the grains glowing as though touched by fire. She drew back with a hiss, then laughed, a sound broken into 2 tones that scraped against each other like rusted metal. Velimir did not flinch. Instead, he lowered the knife slightly, keeping his gaze steady. "If one soul longs for rest," he said, "then let me help it find peace. Show me how to free it." For the first time, the Striga faltered. Her head turned sharply, as though the 2 voices argued within her. A long silence followed. Then, very slowly, she whispered, "Bury me true, and the hunger will end." But even as she spoke, the other voice rose beneath hers, growling, "No grave will hold us." The graveyard fell back into silence, the Striga's words still twisting in Velimir's mind. He remained within the salt circle until the first pale light of dawn filtered through the trees. When at last he stepped away, he left behind the broken earth and the lock of tangled hair. But he carried with him more than fear. He carried the weight of a promise. If there truly was a way to grant one soul peace, he would seek it. Yet he also knew the other soul, the hungering one, would not relent easily. It would fight, claw, and tear until the end. Velimir returned to the village with eyes shadowed by what he had seen, but he spoke little. The Striga is real, he told the elders, and she is divided against herself. No more than that. It was Lisetta who pressed him for the rest. She was not a stranger to shadows. She had lived on the edge of the forest since childhood, in a lonely cottage after her parents had vanished during a bitter winter. Whispers followed her, too pale, too quiet, eyes that sometimes gleamed strangely in the dark. Some said she'd been marked by the same curse, yet she'd never harmed anyone, and those who came near her hearth spoke of her kindness, the way she brewed herbs that calmed fevers or sang softly while mending torn clothes. When Velimir returned from the cemetery, it was to Lisetta he went. She listened in silence as he told her of the Striga's two voices, of her words about burial, of the laughter that rasped like rusted iron. When he finished, Lisetta laid her hand lightly on his arm. "You cannot do this alone," she said, "and perhaps I can help you understand her hunger." Velimir looked at her sharply, but Lisetta did not flinch. She pulled back the sleeve of her gown, revealing scars across her forearm, thin, pale lines that twisted like the branches of a dead tree. "I was touched once," she whispered. "Not bitten, not broken, but marked. I woke one morning with the taste of blood in my mouth, though I had not eaten. For days I could hear breathing in my dreams, a second voice whispering just beyond my own. It has faded, but it never fully left. Sometimes in the deep of night I feel it stir, her eyes lifted to meet his, steady despite the tremor in her words. If the Striga carries two souls, then I have brushed against one of them. That is why I hear her even when no one else does." Velimir's hand tightened on the iron knife at his belt. "Then you are in danger," he said. Lisetta shook her head slowly. "No, it means I am bound to her, and if we are to end this curse, it may be through me." The fire crackled in Lisetta's hearth, casting long shadows across the small cottage. Velimir sat opposite her, his bow resting against the wall, the iron knife laid carefully on the table between them. He had hunted beasts of fang and claw, but none that spoke in two voices, none that carried both sorrow and rage in the same hollow body. Lisetta's calm unsettled him, almost more than the Striga's hiss. She moved with the quiet certainty of someone who had lived for years in the borderland between dread and endurance. She poured him a cup of bitter tea, fragrant with herbs he did not recognize, and when he hesitated she smiled faintly. "It will not cure fear," she said, "but it will make your hand steadier." As the hours passed, she told him more. Of the night she had first felt the mark stirring inside her, how her dreams filled with the sound of wings scraping against stone, of mornings when she awoke with scratches across her skin, though no nails of hers had left them. "It is not constant," she murmured, staring into the flames, "but it is enough to remind me. I am not untouched, and if I can feel her hunger, perhaps I can call to the soul that longs for rest." Velimir's brow furrowed. "And if the other answers?" Lisetta lifted her gaze. Her eyes gleamed in the firelight, not red like the Striga's, but carrying their own strange depth. "Then you must hold fast. Iron, salt, rowan, your weapons, my voice, my blood, my offering. Between us, Perhaps there is balance. Velimir said nothing for a long time. Outside, the wind pushed against the shutters, moaning through the trees. Finally he rose and took the knife from the table. He slid it back into his belt, then leaned his palms against the wood, looking down at Lisetta. "Very well," he said, "but we go on my terms. No reckless steps, no bargains made in shadows. If we stand before her, we do so with the strength of the village at our backs and the old protections at our feet." Lisetta inclined her head, but her lips curved in a faint, knowing smile. "A hunter's caution," she said softly. "It may be the only thing that keeps us alive." For the first time since his journey to the graveyard, Velimir felt the faint stir of something other than dread. It was not hope, not yet, but it was the beginning of resolve. The Striga would come again, of that he was certain, and when she did, they would not face her alone. The following day dawned grey, the forest wrapped in mist that clung to the roofs of the huts and the bare branches of the trees. Velimir walked beside Lisetta through the narrow lanes of the village, their steps muted by damp earth. The people watched them from behind shutters, suspicion flickering in their eyes. Some crossed themselves as Lisetta passed, whispering words not meant to reach her ears. Velimir noticed, but he said nothing. Her face remained composed, though her hands folded tightly in her cloak. When they reached the square, the elders awaited them. Old men with stooped backs, women with scarves drawn tight against their faces, all carrying the weariness of those who had survived too many winters. Velimir stood tall before them, his bow slung across his shoulder, Lisetta at his side. "The Striga is real," he told them again. "She carries two souls, one that hungers, one that suffers. To free the latter, we must act." Murmurs broke out, rising like a restless tide. Some demanded fire and axes, a purge of the graveyard and salt upon the earth. Others shook their heads in fear. "No grave will hold her," one elder rasped. "We've seen her strength already." It was Lisetta who stepped forward then, her voice clear though soft. "I have felt her hunger," she said. The crowd stilled, uneasy. "I know its echo, for it touched me once. If we are to reach the soul that longs for rest, it must be through me. I will call to her, and Velimir will hold the line." A wave of protest swept the square. Warnings, accusations, prayers all tangled together. But Velimir raised his hand, and slowly the voices died down. "She speaks truth," he said firmly. "We cannot fight the Striga as we would a beast. We must bind her, not slay her. There will be risk, yes, but there is no other path." That evening, preparations began. Iron nails were hammered into wooden stakes, rowan branches gathered from the forest's edge. The women wove cords of flax dipped in holy water, knots tight enough to bite into skin. Salt was poured into small clay jars to be thrown upon the ground, each one sealed with wax. Velimir oversaw the work with steady focus, his mind fixed on the task. Yet in quiet moments, when he glanced at Lisetta, he saw the strain she carried, the weight of fear, the knowledge that she might not return from what lay ahead. And yet, she did not falter. At sunset, when the mist deepened and the air grew colder, she stood with him outside the chapel ruins where Father Tomasz had fallen. "Here," she said softly, tracing her fingers along the cracked stone. "She will come here again." "The hunger will bring her," Velimir nodded, his hand brushing the bowstring, his other resting on the iron knife. The night was coming, and with it, the Striga. Night settled like a heavy cloak over the village. The mist thickened until the air itself seemed to weigh upon every roof, every tree. Velimir and Lisetta moved quietly through the dark, their path lit only by a single lantern shielded from the wind. The ruins of the chapel loomed ahead, its stones cracked and leaning, the altar overturned and blackened by old fire. This, Velimir knew, was where the Striga had first shown her full strength, and it was here she would come again. They set their preparations in silence. Salt scattered in a circle around the nave, iron stakes driven into the ground at its corners, rowan branches laid across the threshold. Lisetta moved with deliberate care, her face pale in the lantern glow, her lips murmuring words too quiet to catch. Velimir watched her, uneasy but resolute. He trusted her, though he did not fully understand the depth of her connection to the creature they sought. When all was ready, Velimir placed his bow at his side and crouched near the altar's remains, knife in hand. Lisetta stood at the centre of the circle, her cloak pooling around her feet. She closed her eyes and drew in a long breath. "Do not break the circle," she whispered. "No matter what you see, no matter what you hear. If I falter, it is your blade that must hold the line." Velimir's grip tightened on the hilt of the knife, the iron cold even through his glove. "I will not let her take you," he answered. Lisetta gave no reply, only began to hum, low and steady, a melody older than the chapel's stones. The sound was soft at first, then grew, filling the hollow ruin with notes that seemed to seep into the walls themselves. It was not a song of prayer, nor a plea. It was a calling, a bridge built of sound between one soul and another. The air shifted. Velimir felt it first as a prickling at the nape of his neck, then as a chill that crawled down his spine. The lantern's flame guttered, bending toward the open doorway as though drawn by unseen breath. The night outside grew unnaturally still. The forest hushed, as if every creature held itself in waiting. Then came the sound. 2 breaths, uneven, overlapping, the same he'd heard at the graveyard. A shadow moved at the edge of the doorway, too tall, too bent to be human. Slowly it stepped inside. The Striga's form emerged from the mist, her limbs twisted, her hair a dark veil across her face. Her eyes glowed faintly, not blazing but smouldering, as if with the memory of fire. She stopped at the circle of salt and hissed, the sound carrying both hunger and hesitation. Lisetta's song deepened, her voice steady though her hands trembled. "One soul longs for rest," she intoned. "Hear me. Follow me. Be free." The Striga tilted her head, her mouth opening. 2 voices poured out, one keening in pain, the other growling in fury. Velimir braced himself, the knife gleaming in his hand as the night held its breath. The Striga lingered at the edge of the salt circle, her claws flexing, her breath ragged and doubled. Lisetta's voice wove through the ruin like a silver thread, steady though her body swayed as if each note drew strength from her very bones. Velimir's gaze never left the creature. He saw the tremor in her movements, the way her form flickered between shadow and flesh, as though she could not decide what she was. "One soul longs for rest," Lisetta repeated, louder now, the sound carrying into the rafters. The Striga's head snapped back, a hiss tearing from her throat. 2 cries layered one atop the other, one raw with anguish, the other guttural with rage. The salt at her feet hissed, glowing faintly as her claws scraped against the invisible barrier. Velimir shifted, ready, his knife tight in his grip. He saw it then. Behind the hunger in her red eyes, there was something else, something softer, flickering like a candle in wind. For an instant her gaze locked with Lisetta's, and the lower voice faltered. The higher voice whispered through cracked lips, "Peace." But the moment shattered as the darker tone roared over it, bellowing, "No grave will hold us." The Striga lunged, her body colliding with the salt line. Sparks erupted where her limbs met the barrier, smoke curling up in thin streams. Velimir's jaw clenched as he held his ground, though his instinct screamed at him to strike. Lisetta raised her voice, the melody twisting into a chant older than memory. "Lay down your hunger. Leave behind your shadow. Return to the earth that bore you." The ruin shook with the struggle. Stones groaned, dust fell from the rafters, and the air itself seemed to split beneath the weight of her screams. The Striga clawed at her own chest, her long fingers raking across pale flesh, as if tearing at something inside. Blood dripped, black and sluggish, onto the salt which sizzled louder with every drop. Her body arched, caught between collapse and fury. Velimir stepped forward, his knife raised, the oath heavy on his tongue. But Lisetta's voice surged higher, cutting through the chaos. "Hear me, soul of sorrow. Leave the hunger behind. Come forth and rest." For a heartbeat, the Striga froze. Her head tilted back, her mouth open in a soundless cry. One eye gleamed with fury, but the other dimmed, softened, as if listening. Velimir's heart pounded. The battle was no longer just of flesh. It was the tearing apart of two souls, one desperate for peace, the other determined to consume all that lay before it. The chapel ruins quaked as if the very earth recoiled from the struggle. The Striga writhed at the edge of the salt circle, torn between two halves of herself. Her claws dug furrows into the stone floor, her back arched, and her screams split the air into a chorus of agony and rage. Velimir stood ready, every muscle taut, the iron knife gleaming in his hand. He waited for the moment when mercy would give way to necessity, when steel would decide what voice endured. Yet Lisetta's chant rose above the storm, unwavering. Her hair whipped around her face in the gusts stirred by the creature's fury, but her eyes never left the shadowed form before her. "Release the earth," she cried, her voice ringing like a bell through the night. "Release the hunger. Take only rest." The Striga's body convulsed. From her throat came two distinct cries, louder now, louder than the crashing of stone or the hiss of the salt. One voice pleaded in broken whispers, "Let me sleep. Let me go." The other roared with violence, "We will never yield. We will devour." The air thickened with the clash, a pressure that bent Velimir's knees and made his ears ring. The lantern shattered, plunging the ruin into near darkness, save for the faint glow of the salt circle. And then Velimir saw it, a shape tearing free, pale and thin, rising like mist from the Striga's chest. It was a figure of light, trembling, fragile, with eyes filled not with hunger but sorrow. The peaceful soul. It drifted toward Lisetta's voice, drawn as a moth to flame, but the Striga's body twisted violently, the darker voice howling in fury. Clawed hands clutched at the escaping spirit, dragging it back toward the twisted flesh. Velimir acted. With a cry he hurled one of the clay jars of salt at the Striga's feet. It shattered, releasing a burst of white grains that flared like fire. The creature shrieked, stumbling backward, her grasp faltering. The peaceful soul slipped free again, hovering just beyond the reach of claws. Lisetta's voice broke into sobbing notes, each one raw with effort. "Come to me," she begged. "Come to peace." The glowing figure wavered, then surged toward her, passing through the air like smoke caught in a breeze. As it reached the circle, Lisetta opened her arms, and the spirit touched her chest. For an instant, light filled the ruin, flooding every crack and shadow. Velimir shielded his eyes, the knife burning hot in his grip. The darker half of the Striga howled one last time, a sound that split the night like iron tearing stone. And then the ruin fell silent. Dust hung in the air, and the creature's twisted body collapsed lifeless at the circle's edge. Only the faint glow around Lisetta remained, flickering softly like the last flame of a dying candle. The silence that followed was vast, deeper than the night itself. Dust drifted in thin shafts of moonlight, settling slowly over the broken stones of the chapel. Velimir lowered his knife at last, his chest rising and falling in heavy breaths. He had stood against wolves, against the hunger of winter, but never against a battle of souls. Now, as he stared at the still body of the Striga, he felt no triumph, only the weight of sorrow and the strange, quiet relief that the struggle was done. Lisetta remained in the circle, her eyes closed, her hands pressed gently against her heart. The faint glow that had surrounded her lingered for a moment longer, then faded like mist beneath the morning sun. She opened her eyes slowly, and Velimir saw exhaustion written deep across her face. Yet there was something else too. Peace. "It is finished," she whispered, her voice barely more than breath. Velimir stepped to her side, steadying her as she swayed. "Did you free her?" he asked. Lisetta's gaze drifted toward the lifeless form. "One soul rests," she said softly. "The other is gone. Where, I cannot say. But she is no longer whole, and no longer bound here." They left the chapel together, stepping into the cool embrace of the forest night. The mist had lifted, and above them the stars shone bright and clear. The village slept behind shuttered windows, unaware that the danger had passed, that the whispers which haunted them would soon become only stories. Velimir looked once more at Lisetta, her face pale but calm in the starlight. He wondered what shadow she would carry now, what mark this night would leave upon her soul. Yet for the first time he did not see her as the villagers did, not as cursed, not as touched by darkness. He saw her as she was, steadfast, unbroken, the voice that had called peace out of a nightmare. At the edge of the forest they paused. The night was utterly still, as if holding its breath in reverence. Velimir set down his bow, resting it against the trunk of an old oak. Lisetta leaned into him, her head against his shoulder, and for a long moment they simply stood together in the quiet. The world no longer pressed so heavy, the fear no longer so sharp. "Rest," Velimir murmured, though whether he spoke to her, to himself, or to the soul now at peace, he could not tell. Lisetta closed her eyes, and the faintest smile touched her lips. The stars wheeled silently above, eternal witnesses to the struggles and the small mercies of humankind.